Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on cyber influence operations and the impact on democracy. Bonjour, nami kia koto. It's wonderful to see you here today. My name's Paul Ash. I'll be guiding us through the next 45 minutes. I'm very pleased today to be joined by an exceptionally distinguished grouping of guests. We have Brad Smith, President of Microsoft Corporation. We have Eleonora Carrois from the French National Assembly, and we have Antonio Zappula, Chief Executive of Thomson Reuters Foundation, with us here this morning. I'd like to start off just by asking each of our guests to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about the nature of the problem they see and their role in understanding that and working on it. So I might start immediately to my left with Antonio and ask if you could please let us know who you are and how you see this issue.
Thank you. So I'm the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and our work is really to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies around the world. And everything that we do is powered by media and legal interventions. So the topic that we're discussing today is particularly relevant for us because obviously when we talk about media freedom, when you're talking about strengthening free, fair, and informed societies, disinformation poses a significant risk.
Thank you, Antonio. Eleonora.
Hi everyone, I'm very pleased to be here, speaking on behalf of the French Parliament, but also I think on behalf of citizens that participate into the democratic processes. I think this issue that we're tackling today is a major issue for our democracies, both during the electoral process, but also during the life of our democracies. And I think there's a lot to say, and I hope we also have maybe a Q&A, and we can also have your views on how you feel and how this is interfering in the way you're behaving with regards to your democratic systems.
Merci. Brad.
And I think at Microsoft, one of the things we really think about is the intersection between technology and the protection of fundamental rights, of human rights, and the preservation of democracy. And what we're going to talk about today, I think in many ways, represents the single greatest technology threat, or at least the use of technology, to put democracy and the protection of fundamental rights at risk. So we have a variety of different efforts underway to address this, and it's great to be here with you folks who also obviously are playing such important roles.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction. I might just ask if I could get you to tease out a little bit about the nature of the problem as you're seeing it today. Obviously, there's been a great deal of concern since the Russian invasion of Ukraine around state-sponsored information operations and efforts to push out not just propaganda, but out-and-out disinformation or false information. I wonder if I could just get a sense from each of you as how you see that situation and the threat you see that posing to democracies around the globe. And I might start with Brad, actually.
Well, I think in many ways the war in Ukraine has brought into bolder relief and to the public view problems that were very important already, but they were not getting the attention they deserved. We've certainly seen in the short term a sharp upsurge in Russian-based propaganda, focused in part on the people of Russia, focused intensely on the people of Ukraine, focused on public opinion in the United States and Western Europe, and ultimately on the so-called non-aligned countries, especially in Africa and, say, Latin America. But what this has really done, I think, is helped us understand better what has been a long-standing and very broad focus of the Russian government, really building an ecosystem, a global ecosystem, to advance through cyber influence operations, different messages. And I think to put it in context, ultimately there's only two ways that governments govern. They either rule through force or they rule under the rule of law based on trust. I don't think a democracy can survive if trust dies. And I think that the Russian government understands that. It's developed fundamentally the world's biggest and most sophisticated effort aimed at undermining trust in our societies. And I think now that we understand this better, we need to be alert to this spreading. It already is in some ways to other authoritarian countries who are using similar techniques and tactics focused on the democracies of the world. And we need to come together to defend ourselves much more effectively.
Thanks, Brad. Eleonora, you've had a career focused on upholding rule of law, first as a lawyer and now as a parliamentarian. Seen from here in France, how is this problem affecting the French democratic institutions, French society, and the partners you work most closely with?
Well, thank you. I actually fully agree with you, Brad, because what is happening now, the invasion of Ukraine, has just helped open a few eyes that hadn't seen the problem that was already there. And as you said, this is a long-time strategy by Russia. Actually, there's a very interesting study that I recommend you all read by a French institute called INSERM, which is called The Lion, the Bear, and the Hyenas. And it actually starts with a cartoon that was created by Russia and that has been diffused in African countries, where you see an African village being attacked by hyenas and with little flags with France and the UK, and being defended by the Russian bear. And this is actually shown to very little kids with a nice and appealing voice. And this idea that, you know, France is bad and that France is not welcomed in Africa is something that has been instillated by Russia for a long time with military consequences. And it's the same in Latin America. And it's interesting for me to speak about Latin America as well, because I actually represent French people, the diaspora living in Latin America and the Caribbean. And as we were discussing today, the message that is being diffused by either Russian medias, social networks, fake accounts, is sometimes very different from a country to another. So you would have different messages sent to a Cuban audience because of obviously the links that they have with Russia, very different messages sent to other countries in Latin America. So you see that this is a very intelligent, well thought of military strategy that has been deployed by Russian authorities for years now. And we, of course, and as a lawyer, I am really attached to freedom of speech, but it gets to a point where we don't want to be naive either. And so the fact that we're now opening our eyes in a very brutal way is also maybe an opportunity to change the way we see this danger. And also, just to finish with one thing, is 3 days ago, Emmanuel Macron was in Toulon doing the strategic review for the military forces in France for the next years. And there was a huge focus on fighting against disinformation and destabilization, cyber attacks, and so forth. And this is pretty new in France, and I think in most Western countries. And I think there's a shift and opening of eyes, and in my opinion, is a very good thing.
Merci. Antonio, from the perspective of someone who works in the news industry, how do you see this problem? And in particular, how do you see it affecting, for instance, Spanish language communities globally as well?
I think, you know, talking about disinformation and obviously the expression fake news, there is a really interesting aspect that I think we should be also considering, which is the fake news law that Russia passed recently. And the implication of that legislation, it means that there is now the biggest exodus of independent Russian journalists that have actually fled the country. And they are regrouping into Europe. So they're asking for asylum. There's a big cluster around Berlin. There's a big cluster around Amsterdam and Riga. And we're actually supporting this community. I think that's really important, because keeping that element of free and independent media alive is actually really, really essential, because we also need to be considering what's going to happen, you know, after the situation will actually change in Russia. So the element of free and independent media that needs to be preserved is absolutely essential, also to counter disinformation. I think, you know, Dmitry Muratov, who spoke at our event 2 weeks ago, spoke of an attack to democracy and an attack to people by silencing this big cluster of media freedom. And these are journalists, by the way, who left Russia overnight, maybe being part of a big newsroom, and now are literally broadcasting from their kitchens on a computer. And they have no support, they have no technical support, and they have no legal rights to actually work in this country. So a lot of work has been done to actually bring these journalists legally through asylum applications into Europe, registering those legal entities, opening bank accounts, and giving them a new level of training, because they're going from working in a big newsroom to working literally on their own.
That all sounds deeply concerning, and in a sense, one of the challenges here is that the openness of democratic societies is in effect being played against us. How do we deal with that? What are the solution sets that each of you sees from your different perspectives? Let's start with, say, the technology perspective and the role that technology might play in actually helping solve for some of these problems and address them.
As we've thought about it, we really think that the democratic nations of the world need to work together with a four-part strategic response: detect, defend, disrupt, and deter. Detection really is the first step because it's hard to address something that you don't see or understand. And so that's why we and others, I think, are really building what I hope will be a world-class and world-leading detection capability, as we do for what I would just call other forms of cyber attacks. Because we should just consider this in that same category of using the internet and technology to attack another country. Second, defense is critical, and I think a lot of what we're talking about here falls in the category of defense. You defend against this, in my view, not fundamentally through censorship, but through traditional journalism and invigorating it and ensuring it's helpful, that it's healthy, and that journalists have the rights to do their jobs. You defend against it through better education and stronger media literacy, and other steps, including the protection of political candidates so that they're not hacked, so they can't be impersonated and the like. There's a variety of new disruption techniques that we can develop, but I would say they start by calling out and reporting quickly in real time about what's happening so the public is equipped with better information. I think that these first three pillars all require new forms of public-private partnerships. And then deterrence, in my view, is a unique and sole responsibility of governments. But just as there have been deterrent approaches developed to address other forms of cyber attacks, I think this will be a looming question for governments and public policy. What is the right deterrent response?
Thank you, Brad. And I might move on to Eleanor on that last point, because sitting in the perspective of someone in government, how do you see the tools that governments have to deal with this particular problem? I know the question of deterrence is one that is very much discussed over in the area of traditional information security operations and is an emerging doctrine. How do you see the role of government, particularly from your role as a legislator, in terms of responding to this threat?
Well, like most major crises and threats, I think this requires three things. It requires money, funds. I'm sorry, but it's the case. If we don't invest in disinformation, it's not going to work. If we don't invest in a free press that has the means to actually be free from this influence, we're not going to go anywhere. Second is we need to do it globally. There's no point in France enacting regulation on its own and then the European Union having another perspective and then the UK doing itself on its own. I mean, there's no borders or frontiers for information on the internet, so it's very difficult to do this on a national level. And then the third thing is, as you mentioned, it has to involve multiple actors. You cannot ask government and parliaments to deal with this and just, enact the perfect law that will actually solve all the disinformation problems. The only way to do it is through the help of public-private, the press, but also, I think this is the most and the key question for me is how to educate the citizen, but also the legislators, also the governments, also the actors of these forums, also yourselves. How do we educate ourselves to see that we're actually being manipulated? How do we see that the algorithm that we're all living in, because we all have our social networks and we're looking at the number of likes, how do we know that this is true? What does it represent? Who is behind that? And to that, I think sourcing the information we get is key. We don't know the source. We don't know where it comes from or exactly who has changed it. We don't know that a video that we see is genuine or not. And all these things are key. And when I mean ideally, we would have a massive plans to educate kids at school so that they know right from wrong, that the truth does exist, that there's things that are being proven, and that that news is not just the same whether a friend tells you that it saw it on a social media platform, or when you read it on a newspaper that has been vetted and edited and that has a big liability for defamation, so that there's different kinds of news and information that you receive. This you have to tell the kids, but you also have to tell the older people, the government. So I think we all need to be educated, but for that you need money and you need cooperation.
Thank you, Eleonore. Antonio, from the perspective of a news organisation, from a foundation working in that area of promoting open journalism and supporting journalists, how do you see the sorts of solutions we need, and how do we manage that question of openness being played against us?
We've been doing a lot of work on fact-checking, but
Je crois qu'il est nécessaire de vérifier les faits dans bien des cas, et c'est un vrai problème. On vit dans une société extrêmement polarisée, et quelquefois, vérifier les faits ne suffit pas. J'entends parfois des conversations où il semble que les faits n'ont plus d'importance, et c'est quelque chose, moi, qui me terrifie. Alors, pour revenir à ce que vous disiez, je crois qu'il est important d'investir dans un journalisme de qualité. Et j'y reviendrai plus tard. Et par ailleurs, en tant que membre d'un monde démocratique, nous devons nous doter d'un cadre qui soit adapté au type d'information que nous voulons, avec une protection des droits, avec une protection de la vie privée et de la liberté. On constate qu'avec les technologies qui existent dans les autres pays, qui sont utilisées ailleurs, Afrique, Asie, nous allons hériter d'un nouveau modèle de technologie qui...
And I hear a lot of conversations around regulations that go nowhere. There are significant tensions clearly between the EU and America. Think of the situation with Snowden, but I think the sooner we can have a very fair and open and frank conversation, and to your point, public-private conversations and partnerships around the future of the governance of the technology and the internet that we want, the better. To the point about independent journalism, our framework is really around three. We like lists, since we know 3 is a good number. But for us, it's really about safety, sanity, and sustainability. So we work in terms of keeping journalists safe. And for us, safety is not just physical; it's also online, cyber, and also legal. And happy to talk about that. When it comes, obviously, to the sustainability aspect, we need to remember that, to your point, journalism needs money. Good quality journalism needs money. Needs money to prop up investments in technology within newsrooms. We're working a lot in our own newsroom, for example, to embed SEO optimization, to make sure that journalists understand that journalism has changed, the profession has changed, that requires more money. But also the link between sustainability and independence is crucial, because if you look at small media outlets that work in countries where free speech and media freedom is not particularly upheld, they are hugely dependent on advertising. And who controls the advertising? The government controls the advertising. And if they're not the governments, they are proxy business that work in conjunction with the government. So all it takes for a government to silence an independent media outlet is just to pull the advertising out. And that media outlet is absolutely quashed overnight. So the link between sustainability and independence is also very important.
Thank you, Antonio. Brad, I can see you've got a few observations here.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that this is such a critical part of this issue. I mean, how do we ensure that independent journalists can continue to play the role of continuing to be the fourth estate, if you will, for the democracies of the world? And I think you've captured a lot of this, and I think part of this is an economic issue, and part of it is really a legal and political and diplomatic issue. And on the economic issue, I think you've alluded to a lot of this. You really have to think about it in terms of both cost and revenue. There are opportunities, and you're describing it, and you all are doing important work in this area. We're doing work. There's some other major foundations, in effect, giving journalists the opportunity to share infrastructure. You use technology tools that are more widely available, to obtain information, do fact checking, assemble their content, and then actually publish it online. And I think giving independent journalists who are sometimes, as you say, operating on their own, the ability to, say, benefit from the scale that a large journalistic enterprise would traditionally have is one way you sort of expand the pool for people basically able to pursue a career in journalism. I think the revenue issue is in many ways even a harder one to solve right now. We're seeing innovation in terms of different business models. But fundamentally, I think journalism has suffered because a lot of the traditional revenue sources, namely advertising, have fundamentally shifted. Advertising revenue that used to go to publishing enterprises have fundamentally gone to the tech sector. And that's why we've been supportive of legislation in Australia and elsewhere that would look for new ways, in effect, to share the revenue that I think fundamentally is generated by journalists so that more of it flows back. If you can make the economics better, that'll help us as we address these other issues. And I think what you're getting at is also clearly at the essence of the problem. If journalists can be imprisoned or silenced, it doesn't matter. The economics will collapse. And so, part of this is the work to ensure that journalists have rights to legal counsel. Oftentimes, we're working now around the world to ensure that there's access to pro bono legal counsel. But there also needs to be, frankly, a spotlight put on cases around the world when journalists are put on trial. And I think that there's a couple of elements here that play critical roles. One is a program I'm particularly enthused about, pursued by the Clooney Foundation for Justice. I'm on the board, but it's where Amal and George Clooney have really led the work. Microsoft has provided the technology tools so that when a journalist goes on trial, there is somebody in the room, the courtroom, who is a moderator. That information each day is captured, it goes to the cloud, it can be reviewed by a panel of independent judicial experts in another country, so that judges and governments and prosecutors know that they are going to be subjected to scrutiny. And then I think fundamentally we're all reliant around the world on the role of the United Nations, on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the UN Human Rights Agency, as it's now often called. And I think that all of these layers need to be looked at together, and our best hope really for the future of journalism, especially in countries where journalism is in peril, is to think about how to knit all this together.
Thanks, Brad. And in one sense, if we're talking about journalists, it's appropriate we're in Paris, where the estates were first developed, and the fourth estate developed off the back of that. Eleanor, can I just ask, from the perspective of a politician, from a regulator who's looking at strengthening resilience in your society, what are you looking for from the tech sector and from journalists and civil society? What are the key things that you think are needed to build resilience in our societies against state-sponsored operations of this sort?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because we mentioned before technology, and technology is key. We don't have it at a government or parliamentary level. So being able to source the information, being able to have the right tools to assess it, to see the threat, what you mentioned at the very beginning, the detection part, I think is key. And that is a bit that I think it's difficult for governments or legislators to do alone. And that's where we need journalists doing their job and actually identifying this fake news, and you have more and more journalists specializing in the fight against fake news and also doing fact checks, and you have it in most newspapers and medias. And then also from you, the help, also, just the technical help, I think it's key. Then on the other side, I think the dialogue that we're having here is essential too. And also an assessment of the legislation, because a lot has been done. I mean, it's not new, this topic. We are just seeing it in a very enhanced mirror because of the war in Ukraine. But we've all been aware that there's an attack, and we're not naive. And there has been some legislation. I'm not sure it works. I'm not sure it's sufficient. And again, I think we need a massive investment in citizen education and in democracy. The other key factor that we haven't really mentioned yet is the fact that there's more and more people not voting, not expressing themselves because they'd rather do it on the internet, they'd rather comment, and they'd rather just be part of this massive conversation rather than go and to the polls. I think there's also an education to democracy, and that the two topics are linked, really. And yeah, I think once you educate, once you have more and more people aware of what they're getting, then you can regulate. But there's no point in regulating if you don't educate, and we need both of you for this.
Thank you. Antonio, what are you looking for from government and the tech sector?
I'll answer that, but I also want to kind of carry on the conversation that Brad was making about the legal risks, because that is really, really, really important to us. That's really at the core of the work that we do. So I'll come to that, I promise. But I think the point I wanted to stress is that I think people don't really fully grasp the gravity of the legal risks that journalists are facing right now. And Maria Ressa created this expression lawfare to really explaining how the law is tactically being weaponized against journalists with obviously a specific goal, which is the one of silencing them. So from one perspective you have disinformation and propaganda campaigns, from the other hand you have these tactics to silence journalists altogether. And what we are seeing is that journalists around the world are no longer being sued for libel and defamation. They are also continuing to be sued for that, but they are increasingly being sued for corruption, money laundering, tax evasion, cyber libel. There is increasingly amount of slaps that are being thrown at them, and often these lawsuits are thrown at them at the same time. So it's not uncommon to see a libel or defamation case and an anti-corruption charge being thrown at a journalist. Now, if you are an independent journalist that doesn't have a significant newsroom with significant legal counsel resources at the back, you are effectively alone, fending off multiple court cases which are costly, which are lengthy, and basically they put you at risk of going bankrupt. So what we are seeing, we're talking to a lot of independent journalists, especially those that work in investigative reporting, that are, as a result of these legal threats, are refusing to take on work because they fear that they won't be able to defend themselves, because obviously this is a massive threat. Now, the result of this is that we have Maria Ressa, obviously everybody knows in this room who she is, 3 court cases, Patricia Campos Melo, who works for the Foia di San Paolo, another significant amount of court cases. Daphne Caruana Galizia, killed in Malta. The Conscience of Malta had 40 court cases against her. So this is unfortunately working, and is working really well. And the result is obviously that the reputation of the journalist is immediately tainted, because until you're proven innocent in the eyes of the public, you are now a corrupt. And I was looking at the Edelman Trust Barometer that came out earlier this year. To your point, Brad, about trust, 67% of people globally believe that journalists are intentionally misleading the public. And that's up 8% from the year before. So to your point about education, to your point about trust, legal threats to journalists tarnish their reputation, are yet another tool to really break this link of trust that we actually need to prop up and strengthen.
Thank you. It's a really good point to bring out, because it speaks to a very deliberate, concerted effort. To the earlier point that actually this is a tool of oppression and of a concerted campaign of almost military activity to try and undermine the institutions we have. There's that old aphorism that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. And in a sense, we all depend on it, governments, industry, and civil society and journalists. How do you think we can best build constructs where those different groups can work together on this problem? One of the issues we've had with panels and discussions, I think, is we very much focus on what gets in the way of cooperation. What are the key places where we could build collaboration such that we can build what we call modern deterrence, a more structured national approach to resilience in this area? Might start here.
I think, I mean, it's an old-fashioned answer, unfortunately, but it's collaboration. We need to work together. We work with Microsoft, we work with the Clooney Foundation, we work with governments, we work with civil society organizations, we work with corporates, we work with journalists. And when you do that, you are able to actually trigger significant change, even if it's just in connecting people that don't normally talk to each other. And I think the more we see of that sort of strategic collaboration that is, I guess, powered by an alignment of vision, to my point earlier about this idea of creating a future, a democratic future for technology, the merrier.
Thank you.
Sure. No, I fully agree with the cooperation. I think we need filters. And again, this goes back to my earlier point on education. I think journalists are subject to an ethic. They've been formed. They have these lawsuits that you mentioned that are totally manipulative and that are against them and are sort of a war against journalism. But other than that, you also have the fact that you need to be careful on defamation and what you write and verify your sources. And so people are presented with information without knowing, without filtering between opinions and facts, between journalism and just, commentators or self-identified journalists. And sometimes it's very difficult to tell one another, especially when you have countries deliberately acting for that, people not doing this distinction. So again, I think cooperation is great and we need it, but we really need focused action on, I want to call it regulation for lack of a better word, but I think we have such an influx and a saturation of information, and we need to make sure that people can see. I'm not in favor of putting away information or on silencing anyone, but really that they see that there's a difference. And I think journalists have a role to play in that too, because you have more and more classical and medias that also have chat rooms, that also have click to information that is not proper information. So I think we all need to do this work of, maybe presenting a different panel of information for citizens to understand and to really be able to inform themselves in an intelligent manner.
I would actually build on this by starting with a couple of broader conceptual points. The first thing that I've just been struck by is that more than most technology-connected issues, the protection of democracy and especially the assaults on democracy really connect engineering with social sciences much more. And it really behooves us all to think in those terms. Now, when you look at the world from a broad, say, political and economic perspective, one of the defining characteristics of most democracies is that it's really a stool with three legs. There's the government and the public sector, there's business and the private sector, and there's civil society with NGOs or nonprofits. And if you look at most authoritarian countries, they may only have, in effect, one leg, or it's one leg called the government that's really managing the other two legs. And fundamentally, since the late 1700s here in France or in the United States or around the world, it's been the three legs of this stool that have driven not just the progress for democracies, but the fundamental improvements in prosperity and invention itself. Now, we don't talk about it that way very often, but I actually believe that the most sophisticated effort to combine social science and engineering right now is frankly in Russia. They understand this. And what their goal is in part to constantly pit each of the three legs against each other. And that's not that hard to do, because when you think about the political debate in many democratic societies, think about what we argue about. Well, some people want government to be stronger so that business will be more regulated. Others say, no, we want business to be stronger, and in order to do that, we need government to be weaker. That's appropriate. It's even important. But we need to add a new conversation. How do we harness the three legs of the stool? And I think a lot of times it starts with role clarity. What do we want each segment to do? In my view, government, by definition, governs. It has the most important role in creating the rule of law. But what's also interesting is if you want invention, if you want real technology innovation, well, nobody does that better than the private sector. If you want somebody to take what is invented in business and develop new solutions for society, call it moving from invention to incubation, nobody does that better than the nonprofit sector, civil society, and the NGOs. And if you find solutions that work, there's only one way to bring them to scale. That's through government and government funding and government-sized budgets. So let's start to have a new conversation about how we work together and, of course, how we control each other's excesses, but recognize that this is an enormous strength, and the worst thing we can do is to fail to appreciate it.
Thank you. I think I'm hearing some real commonality here, and one of the key things is finding those points of commonality. As I'm hearing you, Brad, I think of a monopedal society that can hop very fast, and a tripedal one that actually is a lot more stable, but takes a bit of coordination to get working and walking. I'd probably want the stability of the tripedal one. I wonder if I could just quickly move to two things. The first, we've talked a lot about the role of education, and there are societies that are world leaders in this. I think the Finns have done a tremendous job over the years of building resilience. The Swedes not far behind them. Do we have the time, though, to be building that through our education systems? Because that's a slow burn process when we're actually facing really active campaigns. And if not, how do we close that gap for people that are already out of the formal education system? News media is one aspect, but I'm not sure it's always going to get there. Thoughts on that challenge that we face?
Sure, I'll start. I think we don't have the choice. We don't have the choice. Maybe we feel we don't have the time, but it's like climate change. We don't have the choice. We just have to do it. And we have to do it because the impacts of what can happen if we don't do it are so huge that it's frightening. Look at the Capitol attack in Washington, D.C. I never thought that I would see that happening in the US. I was brought up in Latin America. I was used to coup d'etat, but I never thought that this was possible in the United States of America, where people, I thought, were more educated and would not, be manipulated like that. Climate change also, you have so many people challenging that it exists today with all the evidence we have, with all the scientists working on this for decades, and we still have people being influenced by media that just tell them that it doesn't exist and being convinced that it doesn't exist. So I'm sorry to respond like that. We don't have the choice. We have to do it. We should coordinate so we don't all try to fight on our own and then, waste some time and go slowlier than we should. But I think to have some concrete ideas, we should look at what works. We should look at the Finns. We should look at Sweden. We should implement real courses in our schools and build this resilience, as you said. And again, funds. It all comes back to how much money we want to invest in this as opposed to other things. And I think for people to be willing to pay taxes to fund these programs, they need to understand how risky it is not to do so.
Thank you.
I just want to come back in because I completely agree with you. And you must have heard this, of course, but the day after Brexit, the most searched online word in the UK, the sentence was, "What is the EU?" So, to your point about education, we are not taught civil rights or civic education at school anymore, which has consequences such as, but not in the UK, for example. And so the result is that you then have to Google or Bing what's the EU the day after a referendum. The other thing that strikes me is the willingness to pay for good quality information. I guess hands up in this room who pays for a Netflix subscription, and hands up who pays for media. So people are willing to pay $6.99, whatever that is in this country for entertainment, but when you ask them to pay for news, they're unwilling to do so. And there is something really telling there that I can't detect right now. I can't unpack it right now, but we need to educate people the good quality information. To your point, you go to school, you train, you understand what libel and defamation is. That has a cost on you. That has to be remunerated and paid back by your employer, which has a cost for the business. So why is there this understanding and this almost expectation that good independent quality news has to be free? I disagree. It cannot be free.
I just have a question. Do you think people will pay again for media? Do you think that's
Statistics
possible?
are showing that they're not paying for media. They're paying for media in the US and they're paying in northern countries, but
look
they're
at-
not paying in the rest of Europe.
Yeah, but in the New York Times, for instance, I'm struck by that. Can media change?
So just coming back to this.
I would say, look, I think there's some cause for hope. You see these different content-based sectors go through cycles. I also happen to be on the board of Netflix, so I've seen, from a first-hand perspective, how the production of audio-visual content for, say, entertainment and information purposes, went from a period of time when it felt like there would not be as many opportunities for people who create content to earn a living doing so. But business model and technology evolved in a way that I think has almost created a new golden age for the people who want to produce, say, movies and television shows. I think we have to find and, in effect, iterate our way there. But I would like, if I could, just to go briefly back to Paul, your other question. Think about all of the issues relating to democracy in Latin America. And then consider this. There are more people in Latin America today that get their news from RT than from CNN. And how many of the readers and viewers of RT do you think know that they are in fact getting their news from the Russian government? So there is an urgent need for education, and some of it can be relatively straightforward. Let's start with the easiest things first. And then ultimately, I think the fundamental goal is a little bit like what we've learned from, say, phishing attacks and spam. You want people to learn how to recognize who the sender is or who the speaker is. Who is this who is publishing this? And we've all gotten smarter and more sophisticated in how to look at an email and, wait, who's on that email address in terms of the sender? What are the characteristics that you look at in an email to discern whether it's likely to be fraudulent? So there's a lot to do, but some of this we can do much more effective at, I think, quite quickly.
I'm really pleased you raised that link back to cybersecurity, because many of the transmission means and tools are the same. In effect, what we're watching is the operation of information on behaviors and organizations in the same way that malware operates on code and machines. And we've learned quite a lot from the cyber world about sharing information, about transparency. And I will just throw this one to Brad quickly, because over in another area, we're working on things around algorithmic issues, for instance, with Christchurch core work. How do you see us developing the models to work across those three sectors in information operations in the way we have done in cyber over the years? What is the key ingredient there?
Certainly one of the things that I think comes out of this is the ecosystem that has been built by certain governments to engage in cyber influence operations ultimately does turn at the end on amplification through social media. And you really have, in my view, in the Russian government especially, an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of how to exploit the flaws, if you will, in social media, architecturally and algorithmically. So, just as we've really been pushing for more transparency, there's the recent initiative from the New Zealand government, the United States government, Microsoft and Twitter, and we very much hope and we very much need Twitter's continued support for this. It's about opening up data sets so we can start to better understand the impact of algorithms. In that context, it's about spreading extreme violence or terrorism. In this context, the phenomenon is different, but whatever we learn in one area will, I think, be directly applicable in another. I do think it points more broadly to the importance of transparency. In a way, everything about this, you can think about authoritarianism versus democracy. Well, you have two fundamental tools to address, let's just say, bad ideas or inaccurate information. One is censorship, the other is transparency. The fundamental tool of any democracy at the end of the day is transparency, shining more light so that people can make up their own minds and we have some level of faith and confidence in the electorate, but only with the transparency that is needed so that the electorate can become informed. So I think this does connect.
Fantastic. And I think when we've talked with some of the countries that have worked longest on this issue, as well as education, one of the things they've told us that's most important to them is their freedom of information legislation, openness and transparency in government, openness and transparency in the corporate sector and civil society. As we close, because I hate everyone to go away from this on a beautiful Saturday in Paris feeling really down about this, your elevator pitch around reasons for optimism. What are the things that leave us feeling like we're going to be able to navigate this and come out with democratic societies stronger than ever? Antonio.
I'm struggling here, but I guess it's this idea that media freedom is at the center of everything that we just discussed, and it actually impacts all of us. And so my optimism is that especially the young generations will understand that a society where media freedom is not upheld has practical, tangible repercussions on people's lives. So my hope is the future generations.
Thank you, that's great. I learn a lot from my children, and now that I'm a grandparent, I'm looking forward to learning from my granddaughter. Eleanor.
I agree. I'm a very optimistic person in general, and I believe we're very resilient, much more than we think. We are facing massive crisis. We are seeing things that we never thought we would see on our lifetime, such as war in European soil, such as attacks in the biggest democracies. But at the same time, we're also here, we're discussing their tools that I wasn't aware of, that maybe I should learn more about. I was glancing at the Microsoft report on this very subject, and there's a lot to learn in there. And I think there's a lot we can do. You said, let's start with the easy stuff, and maybe the easy stuff, just shedding the light and showing people that there's actually ways to differentiate, to add filters, to understand that maybe something is not true, or maybe something is just an opinion and not a fact. It seems basic, but I think we can do it if we really want to do it, and at least we're committed to do so at the French Parliament.
Fantastic.
I would just say at the end, two things give me optimism. The first is I think that the key to solving any problem always starts by understanding it. And I think we are and can develop a much greater capability to understand this problem, understanding how it works, understand when it's being used. And the second thing that gives me optimism is that on a beautiful day in Paris, all of you showed up. Because if we can use this information and work together, we can actually begin to push back. That needs to be the first step, and then figure out how to turn the tide. But I believe it can be done.
Thank you, Brad, and I think that's a great note to end on. The discernment that comes from understanding, the discernment that comes from working together. This is a conversation that I suspect would have been much harder to have 5 years ago. And we're now able to have this and actually open up a lot more about what each of us brings to this. So thank you. If I could ask for some applause for a wonderful, wonderful set of panelists. And for all of you for coming and joining. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.